Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Good day. Welcome back to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. This is episode 39. And for Kenny, Mike, and myself, Jim Seibert, thank you for joining us again. This week, we're going to be talking about Brake Safety Week in the month of August. For several years running, Brake Safety Week has been held in either August or September, so it's no surprise it's coming back around for us. Why do we conduct Brake Safety Week? Well, brake-related violations comprise the largest percentage of all out-of-service vehicle violations cited during roadside inspections. And according to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's 2023 vehicle violation data, 6 out of the top 20 vehicle violations were brake-related. And last year's CVSA International Road Check results showed the brake system violations was the top vehicle violation, comprising 25% of all vehicle out-of-service violations during that 3-day data snapshot of roadside inspections. So looking back to last year, about this time, we did another Brake Safety Week podcast, and we shared the results from the previous year, 2022. I wanted to go a little bit further. I wanted to look for a pattern. And so I was all over the CVSA website looking at the previous weeks and even their unannounced days and tried to look at, hey, what were we getting cited for? It's tough when we do this every single year. So we should be internally looking at what are we getting citations for, and that being a special focus, a special emphasis prior to this week and at all times, to be honest. I mean, if these are the key violations, then we need to be focused in that area because naturally it's a safer outcome. So 2019, 34,000 commercial motor vehicles were inspected. 13.5% were placed out of service. 2020, 43,000 inspected, 12% placed out of service. 2021, 35,000 inspected, 12% placed out of service. 2022, 34,000 inspected, 13.6 placed out of service. In 2023, 18,000, almost 19,000 commercial motor vehicles were inspected, and 12.6 were placed out of service. So the unannounced inspection day held in June this year, almost 5,000 vehicles inspected, 11.6 were placed out of service. So if we just look at the 2019 to 2023 amount of commercial motor vehicles inspected and the average placed out of service, that number is 12.5% of all vehicles that get inspected during this week are placed out of service. So what should our goal be this year, gentlemen? What do you think we can do different to lower that percentage?
Well, Jim, CVSA on their website, they put out that they have 2 goals, for Operation Air Brake. And really, the Operation Air Brake covers 2 things. It's the 1-day unannounced event that you've already discussed, and then it's Brake Safety Week. But the goals, it's twofold. One is to reduce crashes. That is always the goal of any safety initiative that comes out of either FMCSA or CVSA, is to reduce crashes. The other one is, and I'm going somewhere and I'm going to answer your question with this, the other one is to educate. And they don't just drop it there. They say to educate drivers, mechanics, owners of the proper brake inspection, maintenance, and operation procedures. So what can we do to lower that out of service? What can we do to reduce these violations? Well, we can help educate our drivers, our mechanics, and our owners so that the proper inspection, the proper maintenance, proper operation of these air brake systems is taking place. And you mentioned it's roughly 12%. Every one of us have been driving down the interstate and come up on either a port of entry or a scale location, depending on what your state calls it. And if you look at the queue, and I was in Houston not long ago and coming back north on I-45 out of Houston, Texas DPS has a huge scale operation at New Waverly, Texas. And it's got a massive entry, probably a quarter mile long. And the queue, and y'all know what that word means, but the queue refers to the amount of vehicles in a defined space, a parking space. So basically from the scale back to the entrance of that scale location is probably a quarter of a mile. And you may have 12, 15 trucks in that queue, and you got other ones on the interstate already giving their right turn signal to pull into the scales. And you just think about it. If there's 10 trucks in that queue, of those 10, statistically, one of them's fixing to get parked for brakes. And so that just keeps on going all day, every day. And we think about that because we throw out a number. We say 12%. Oh, that's not that bad. It means 88% of them are good. But, you think about it, it's over 1 out of every 10 trucks going down the highway's got defective brakes. I mean, put it in perspective like that. And we often mention that there are things about our industry, even though we love it. We eat, live, and breathe the trucking industry. We love it, and unashamedly so. But there are parts of our industry that we don't need to be proud of. And that's one of them, that 1 out of every 10 trucks going down the highway's got defective brakes. That should be unacceptable in our business. And so as these trucks are pulling into the scales, they're primarily going to be doing, during brake safety week, they're primarily going to be doing level 4 inspections, which are dedicated. That level 4 means they're looking at one specific thing. But I want everybody to hear it. If you don't hear anything else that Kenny says today on this podcast, know this. Even though they're going to get on a creeper and get under the truck, or your truck's going to pull over a pit, there's going to be an inspector underneath it looking. And he or she's focus is going to be your brake system. But if they see anything else, they're not just going to ignore it and say, oh, all we're doing today is brakes. It's just that they're focusing on brakes. But once they get under there, if they start finding stuff, you're going to get the full meal deal. They're going to do everything. And one thing that Mike and I have seen the last couple of years, and I know you, Jim, you're in the state of Oklahoma, and Oklahoma Highway Patrol has just started this. There's some states now that are using a new device called a performance-based brake tester, or a PBBT. And it's basically a mechanical device that a truck literally pulls up onto. And much like if a driver will think about the way a dynamometer works, where a wheel is spinning and then certain measurements are taken off that, this device is designed to measure brake efficiency. What we normally get when we're looking at brakes, we measure push rod travel, we visually inspect the components, and every year there's a focus for brake safety week. And this year it's brake linings and pads. So they're going to be looking at that. Anything dealing with cracks or defective, or it's got grease or oil on it, anything dealing with the actual braking surface itself, they're going to be looking very closely at that this year. But these PBBTs, these performance-based brake testing devices, they're doing something we've never been able to do in the past, and they're measuring brake efficiency. Even if all the components are there, how effective are those brakes? How effective are they percentage-wise in what they ought to be? And that's a brand new measurement that more and more states are going to. And I just happen to think of it because you're in the state of Oklahoma, and Oklahoma has just started using them. So, guys, if y'all pull into the scales and you see this, the ones I've seen are painted bright yellow. They're almost the color of, safety yellow. And if they ask you to pull up on it, and they'll start with the steering axle, and then they'll pull the drive axle, and then the trailer, and they measure the braking efficiency on your truck. And if it doesn't meet a certain criteria, there's an out of service for that as well. So they're going to be looking at all that. Now, one thing Mike and I always do too, we know there's a lot of safety directors that listen to us. Safety directors, men and women, I want to encourage y'all to do two things. Number one, get in the regs. If you'll look at Part 393 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, there's 14 separate sections dealing with brakes. The one you really need to focus on right now is 393.47. That deals with pads and lining. I want you to look at that. Also look over on 396.25, which is in the inspection part. that tells you the criteria you have to work on brakes, to inspect brakes. There are some very specific criteria for who can even mess with the brakes on a commercial motor vehicle. That's normally found during an audit. But the problem is, if your truck gets parked on the side of the road and the brakes are bad enough, the trooper's going to refer it for an audit, and then they're going to come in and look and see if the people you got working on the brakes are even qualified to be doing that. And then the other thing I want you to look at, in addition to the regs, is the out-of-service criteria. There are 13 separate pages in the out-of-service criteria dealing purely with brakes. So the point I'm making with all that, brakes are a big deal. They are a big deal. And we know from this side of the industry, and anybody that listens to us that's ever been involved or had one of their trucks involved in a major accident, that all of the states come back and do post-accident inspections on commercial motor vehicles. If there's serious bodily injury or fatalities, they're always going to do it. And the worst thing that can happen to you in litigation is if they find your truck was involved in a crash and then it had defective brakes. That is just, it's hard to overcome that if you get involved in any kind of litigation. And then the last thing I want to share, and I'll yield to Mike and all of his wisdom and expertise. We always share the resources that are available to our listeners, primarily through CVSA. They have brochures, they have checklists, they have videos, they have FAQs. And the fact that CVSA is a continental, North American continent initiative, those are available in English, they're available in Spanish, and then if any of our listeners have operations in the province of Quebec in Canada, they're available in French as well. So there's a lot of stuff. You asked, Jim, how can we reduce these numbers? We do it by, number one, understanding what the regs are, making sure we're in compliance with that, and then using the resources that are available to us. And again, we ought to be embarrassed as an industry that 1 out of every 10 trucks going down the highway has defective brakes. That is not something I'm proud of as much as I love this industry and am proud of this industry.
Let's revisit the idea of the statistics. Jim started out with that, and I'm going to jump into a couple things Kenny was talking about there. So when we look at statistically speaking, what Jim was talking about, I don't have numbers like this in front of me. This is all, what I'm getting ready to say is all based off of just working with different motor carriers every day. And I would venture a guess to say, anytime you would go out and look at an individual company's roadside performance, what are the top 3 violations you're going to see? It's always brakes, lights, tires, right? It's always going to be those 3 categories for the most part. Brakes are always going to be at the top of the list. It's going to be in those, 1, 2, or 3. It's going to be in there somewhere for any company that you're looking at. So we not only have these statistics from the Brake Safety Week and from the CVSA and what the FMCSA is putting out, I'm going to challenge the individual motor carriers that are listening to us. If you're a safety director out there, just like Kenny was talking about, he gave you some tools there. The other thing I would mention is go look at your company's specific roadside performance data. We have the data nationwide, and we need to look at that because we want to know, all right, what are our peers having issues with? But we also want to know, what are we specifically having an issue with? I think that's very important because it helps us not only get this broad picture of what's going on, but it gives us a real critical eye of what's going on in our own house, in our own backyard. So I think that's really important to look at. And one of the things that Kenny brought up was the CVSA's out of service criteria. And I know we start with the regulations. You mentioned that in 393, we're looking at the regulatory guidance at 393 for the brakes. But if we get into the out of service criteria, one thing I want to point out, because as Jim and Kenny both mentioned, we want to educate the folks that are listening to us, and you guys out there listening may know this, but when you look at the CVSA's out of service criteria, there is really kind of 2 different categories, right? There is an out of service violation that you get that contributes to 20% defective brakes on that combination or that single unit vehicle. And then there's out of service violations where if it's a one-off, it's out of that unit's out of service. It doesn't have to meet 20%. So what I mean by this 20% is, let's say, for instance, you've got a truck, tractor, or semi-trailer. How many brakes we got on there?
10.
10, right?
Yep.
So let's say we get 2 of those brakes out of adjustment, past the threshold. We have reached the 20% defective brake for that unit, that combination unit, right?
Correct.
So that unit then is going to be placed out of service. If they're on the truck's going to be placed out of service. If there's one on each, then the unit's going to be placed out of service. So that's there's violations that fall into that, meeting that 20% criteria for defective brakes. And that's where, when we're talking about this year's focus, the brake lining and the pads, those types of violations fall into that 20% criteria. So that's, if you have a brake on there and you get in there and it says we've got a crack that's exceeding 1.5 inches in length, that brake is defective. That counts as one brake towards your 20% criteria being out of service. So it's important for your mechanics, and your staff to understand how that vehicle is being placed out of service, why it's being placed out of service. If you go in the out of service criteria, it's going to show all of these violations that contribute to that 20%. And then at the end of it, it actually says in there, this is the end of the 20% criteria. And then it gets into the one-offs. So it's important to know that. And hopefully I'm making that clear to folks that aren't familiar with that. But that's something that I think would be good for your mechanics to understand. Now, what I'm not saying is, if your mechanics are looking at a truck and they find a crack in a pad and they say, well, it's just one pad, that truck's good to go. No, if we're finding anything wrong with these brakes, we're getting that thing replaced, whether it's a pad, whether it's the brakes out of adjustment, whatever it is, a line chafing, it doesn't matter. If there's an issue with the brake, we need to get that repaired, whether it's a one-off out of service violation or whether it contributes to that 20%, that 20% criteria. So there's a lot of really good information on the CVSA's website. They print that stuff out, look at that, educate your folks with that. But I'm a big dig into the regs guy. If you dig into Part 393 and you're looking through there, it's going to tell you everything you need to know. If you've got that out of service criteria, it's going to tell you everything you need to know. And then if you have questions, that's when you start reaching out. That's when you reach out. It's like, I don't really understand what they're talking about here, what this violation may be, or where this may come into play. That's when you start making some phone calls. If you were a client of ours, you're picking up the phone, calling Kenny, you're calling Mike, asking the questions and really understand what the standard is that we're being held to. Because, I mean, you guys, it's not rocket science to know these trucks, we're 80,000 pound unit going down the road. It's pretty important that our brakes are working. I mean,
absolutely.
That's the whole focus of this is Kenny was saying, it's to reduce crashes. And the reason we want to reduce crashes is people get hurt, people get killed in crashes. So we want to make sure the brakes are working on these units.
And Mike, with those tips that you were sharing with our listeners, and Jim, going back to the fact that you mentioned the 1 day unannounced. That's where the troopers all get together and they don't tell anybody, but they come out 1 day with their sole focus on stopping trucks and checking brakes. That's what they do. It's a surprise bunch of inspections. But Brake Safety Week, it made me think of this when Mike said, a mechanic found one brake and said, well, that doesn't meet the 20%. We'll go ahead and take our chances on it. Shame on them if they do that, because with Brake Safety Week, this thing is publicized months ahead of time. There is no excuse. There is zero excuse for one of our trucks to pull into a scale operation or get an inspection and have defective brakes. They know it's coming. So, guys, I just want to encourage you. I mean, CVSA is telling the entire world, hey, we're going to be checking brakes this week. Y'all get your house in order. And so I hope our listeners, and I know the majority of our listeners are extremely proactive in terms of safety, and they'll take this to heart. But share this news far and wide, because, again, remember the two goals, and Mike reiterated, reduce crashes and educate. Educate. That's everything from drivers, mechanics, maintenance directors, owners, anybody associated with our industry. Educate them about the proper brake inspection, maintenance, and operation criteria.
The cvsa.org /programs. You guys were spitting out these chapters and verses and the focus here. My preparation prior to this podcast was just going on cvsa.org and seeing what's available. This Brake Safety Week flyer, August 25th through 31st, 10 brake lining and pad tips. You guys already said that's the 2 focus areas. This flyer that they've got out, it's part 2, 393.47, 393.48, metal to metal contact, looking for exposed rivets or lining blocks, really outlining it. These tools are all present. Resources for the drivers and mechanics. It goes into details about what a driver can expect with the performance-based brake testers and what states are using them. So, Kenny, you mentioned Oklahoma's jumping on board here. So it talked about the 11 states. There's so much on this website that will get you prepared for this week. The 10 brake lining and pad tips, this is good stuff. Get it in the hands of your mechanics and start talking about it and preparing for it now. It's happening this month. So without any further comments from Kenny and Mike, thanks for joining us on this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. Please come back for episode 40, where we've got some exciting news and great things happening at Marsh & McLennan Agency that you won't want to miss. So for Kenny, Mike, and I, stay safe and have a great American day.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.